Sir Walter Raleigh, first guy to set up England's first colonies, Virginia, Roanoke. Now these fail. He is not successful, and he loses all of his money. And people start thinking, hey, I don't want to go over there and lose all my money, but I do want to, set up a colony because there are some benefits. I could make some money. Now, I could lose all of my money, but I want to give it a try at least. So they start setting up joint stock companies, which is the next thing on your study guide, page 62. Joint stock company, you're looking at a group of investors. People, if it cost $10,000 to start a colony, before this, that is all Sir Walter Raleigh. He is paying all 10,000 of those dollars. In a joint stock company, you might have 10 people who each pay $1,000, so on and so on. So instead of, if the colony fails, he's out $10,000, which is a lot of money. Each of these people is out $1,000, which is still a lot of money, but it's not nearly $10,000. And so you carry a lot less of the risk in setting up a colony with a joint stock company. The first successful English colony is Jamestown. Here's a picture of Jamestown. This Jamestown is found on page 63 through 64. And the thing that you need to remember about Jamestown is obviously it's the first successful or permanent English settlement, but also that this crop right here, tobacco, saved Jamestown because they start growing it and they start making money. And because they start making money, more people want to come over to Jamestown, which makes it larger, makes it prosper. Because they are growing a lot of tobacco, they are then selling it, and that is making England money. And that brings us to the next term on your study guide, which is mercantilism. Mercantilism can be found on page 62, so you got to go back just a little bit. But the idea here is that the colony produces some sort of raw material. In the Jamestown case, it is tobacco. In this picture's case, it is a beaver, but it's the fur of the beaver. This beaver is trapped and killed. Once again, sorry to be so graphic. If you wanted to see this beaver live, sorry, it's going to be turned into a hat. So the fur from this beaver that is trapped and killed in the colony is sent over to England. It is made into a hat, and then it is sold. And because the home country, or England, has a lot of colonies, they can produce a lot of furs and they can produce a lot of hats, which means they're selling a lot of stuff. This is what mercantilism is. It is selling more than you buy. Selling more goods than you buy. And that is going to make them money. And without colonies, this system doesn't work very well, especially if you're a smaller country like England, because you can't produce as many goods if you don't have as much land. All right? Now, what ends up happening is that the colonists are, doing all of these things for the country, and they're making a lot of money, but they aren't really having any say about anything in the colony. So what they want to do is have a voice in their government and a voice in how much taxes should be or anything like that. So on page 64 to 65, they talk about the House of Burgesses. People in Jamestown maybe one year are going to pay 10% in taxes, and then the next year, without them having any say, it goes up to 20% and then 30% or whatever. And it's going up without them having a say in how much taxes should be. The problem with that is it's not that they don't want to pay taxes, it's that they want to have a say in how much taxes should be. It would be like you waking up in the morning, unplugging your phone from the cell phone charger and somebody saying, okay, that's $5. If you want to use your phone, that's $5. And you didn't have any vote in this. That's just how things are now. And then maybe a month later it's $10. And it just keeps on getting more and more, and nobody is asking you or letting you vote. What the House of Burgesses does is it sets up the first representative form of government in the colonies. So it's the first representative form of government in the colonies. And we talked about representative government by saying, if the school has a school-wide vote, if it was a representative government or a representative school government, each class would pick one person from that class to go up to the office and vote in the way that the majority of people in our class want to vote. So they would go up to the office and represent us in the office by voting yes or no, or however the majority of the people in class wanted to vote. So the House of Burgesses, first form of representative government in the colonies. What happens to Jamestown is that it gets taken over by the king because he says that he's worried about some Indian or Native American rebellions and stuff like that. But basically what happens is it becomes a royal colony. And the definition for royal colony can be found on page 65, but it's pretty simple to remember what a royal colony is. It's a colony that is run by the king. So, it's royal. The king's a member of the royal family. All right, let's move on to Chapter 3, Section 2. We're looking at the dissenters. A dissenter is somebody that disagrees. So disagrees with the establishment. In this case, we're talking about the church. When we look at the pilgrims, we're looking at page 68. Remember, the pilgrims, before they were the pilgrims, were the separatists. They come over to America because they are being persecuted. They don't like the Church of England. They want to separate from it because they are separatists. So they separate and leave, and they become pilgrims when they come to America. They ride over on the Mayflower, and because they land outside of the rule of the English, they set up their own document with their own rules called the Mayflower Compact, which is on page 68. And the Mayflower Compact is the Pilgrims' document that they write that sets up their government, their rules, their laws. Another group of dissenters are the Puritans, and the Puritans can be found on page 68 as well. And what you really need to look at with the Puritans is that, they want to purify, they want to reform the church, they want to, make it better. They don't necessarily want to break away like the separatists or the pilgrims do, but what ends up happening is they get persecuted just like the separatists, so they have to end up moving and leaving anyway. So they come over to the Americas as well. They, set up in New England, and that's kind of what you need to know about them. So let's move on to the next section, which starts on your study guide with proprietary colony, which is on page 78. I put Lord Baltimore up here because Lord Baltimore is in charge of Maryland. Maryland was a royal colony, so it was controlled by the king, but now the king gives it to Lord Baltimore, a single person, and it becomes a proprietary colony. So, because it is a proprietary colony, it is governed by a single owner. So, a single owner runs a proprietary colony, unlike a royal colony where the king runs it. So, an example of a proprietary colony is Maryland, run by Lord Baltimore. When we look at the Tidewater is going to be on page 81. It's down here. I put the Carolinas and Georgia here because both of these areas are going to benefit from the Tidewater because you can grow things like rice or tobacco. Both of these things require a lot of labor, so they are going to require a lot of slaves. Rice requires a lot of labor, tobacco requires a lot of labor, so you're going to have a lot of slaves because, these people at this time are not going to pay people if they can just get slaves. When we look at New Amsterdam, this is something that you guys need to focus on a little bit because this is on page 83, because this was something that people got a little mixed up on the test. New Netherlands is the colony that the Dutch have. New Amsterdam is a city within New Netherlands. It's like the most important city in New Netherlands. The Duke of York comes in, he's from England, he comes in and takes over New Amsterdam, which makes it to where he also controls New Netherland. But New Netherland is the colony. New Amsterdam he takes over, and it becomes New York, like New York City. So New Amsterdam, the city, becomes New York City. And then the English now control the whole colony of New Netherland. So that's important to remember. This is the Duke of York down here. He's the one taking over. The last thing on your study guide is not on here on the screen, but I think you kind of need to focus on, why, at first, with the Puritans and the Separatists, why are they coming over to set up the colonies? Why do they want to have these colonies? Why are they coming over? You need to focus on that. I would focus on why the Separatists and why the Puritans are coming over. Are the Separatists and Puritans looking for gold and riches, or are they looking for another thing? Are they leaving England because they're being persecuted? So if they're being persecuted in England, what are they looking for in America? Okay. What are the differences between how people lived in England and how they lived in America and in the American colonies? And we're looking at Chapter 5, Section 1. This is starting on page 127, and the information that you're looking for this goes through 130. So it's a bit of a big chunk of information, but you're looking at how land ownership is different. In America, a lot of people can own land. Land is plentiful. In England, only 5% of the people own land. How does that impact daily life? Talk about education in the colonies, things that we went over in the notes. And then, you're looking at just similarities and differences between the two groups. And, in America, the literacy rate, or the ability to read, is a lot higher than in England. And you look at, what causes that. Well, if you look at who is coming over here first, you're talking about religious groups seeking religious freedom. So when they have children, they want their children to read the Bible. So they teach their children how to read the Bible, so that equals a high literacy rate. That's what causes that. This influx in people being able to read allows more information to be spread, and newspapers become popular, and that's a big deal when we get closer to the revolution. So in the beginning of the American society, religion is on a huge upswing, but as time goes by, religion isn't really as big of a deal in the colonies, and that concerns a lot of people. So what you see is a push to have religion take a little bit more importance, and this term is the Great Awakening, one of two movements that we talk about in this first lecture. So the Great Awakening, it is a religious movement that sweeps through the colonies in the 1730s and 1740s. Traveling ministers, if we look at this picture, traveling ministers went around and spoke to huge groups and crowds about that you could leave the past behind and start a new relationship with God, and the past doesn't matter what you did in the past, you can be washed of that and start over. And this kind of makes people start thinking, maybe the things that we have done in the past, like the traditions that we've held, listening to the king and doing that kind of stuff, maybe that's not what we should be doing. Maybe we can start over. Maybe we can break away. Maybe we can start a new life, a new way to live. And the Great Awakening makes it easier for people to break away from British authority, and that's kind of why we talk about it. And what you also have to look at is, why would this cause so much change in the society? If you look at American society at this time, it's very, you're working with a lot of churches, a lot of different groups, and when something like this enters into the church, people saying, oh, we can break away from the past. Not everyone in that specific church is going to agree with that. So what would happen is little churches would break apart, and then there would be two churches where there was one. So what you see is that happening all over America, and that changes the way people, live, because there's more churches, there's different types of religions, there's different churches being set up and different beliefs and all this kind of stuff. So, these congregations, which is a group of a church group, people that go to a specific church, these congregations argue and they begin to split up, and that's, a big reason why it changes the American society as much as it does. The second movement that we look at is the Enlightenment, and when we look at the Enlightenment, we're looking at page 132, and we're also looking at John Locke, and he is also on page 132. So John Locke is going to be a huge person of importance in this unit, and the Enlightenment is basically his movement. He is a huge part of it. The Enlightenment is basically emphasizing that human reason and science is the way to get to, knowledge and learning and things like that. What this is a shift from is people just thinking, oh, we're going to, say the king is the king because he's the king, and that's just what it's going to be. And because his dad was the king, so he's going to be the king. Well, now instead, what you have is people thinking, let's use reason here, and maybe think that there are better people out there for the job. Let's go through a process. Let's think about this. So, human reason and science for the Enlightenment. John Locke in particular, he is saying just because the king's father was the king doesn't make him the king. There's no God-given right to rule, and every person has natural rights. John Locke also says that these natural rights should be protected by the government. This is an abbreviation for government, in case you've never seen that before. But these natural rights should be protected by the government. And what John Locke is saying about these natural rights and about them being protected by the government, that is that if the government isn't protecting the natural rights, then the people should, realize that they have to get rid of the government and put in a new one. So, if the natural rights aren't being protected by the first government, the people should realize this and change, abolish, remove, do something to the government that makes them different. And if that government doesn't work out for them, and if that government isn't protecting their rights, then they have to get another one. And so on until you get the right one. That's this whole idea about the Enlightenment, is that we follow a process. We get to the best choice. And if the first thing doesn't work, we change it and put in a new one. And if the next thing doesn't work, we change it and put in a new one. It's like an experiment, but on a huge scale because it's the government. So, as the Enlightenment takes off, not only in the colonies but also in England, people are, trying to get their rights in England as well. And the first step to gaining those rights is the Magna Carta, and this is on page 137. We're moving on to chapter 5, section 2. So, if we look at the Magna Carta here, it is a document that is guaranteeing rights to English people. So, it's guaranteeing rights to English. This is basically, it's going to limit the king's power. It's taxes can't just be enforced, property can't just be seized without, a reason or a vote or something like that. So, Magna Carta is the first document that guarantees rights to the English. And then we move on from the Magna Carta, and then there's the English Bill of Rights. But soon, these rights that they have worked to establish, they come under attack. And they come under attack by this guy right here, who is King James II. King James II takes away takes away people's rights. People don't like that, obviously. And then what happens is Parliament, who is, the lawmaking body of England, they want to get rid of him because he is taking people's rights. So they get rid of him, and they ask William and Mary to become king and queen. That's who these people are over here. So William and Mary become king and queen. They kick James out because he doesn't have any support and he's going to be killed, so he has to leave. And this change in power is known as the Glorious Revolution. This whole story can be found on page 140. And, it's basically the Glorious Revolution. It's the change from James to William and Mary. So the Glorious Revolution is that change in power. The monarchs change. The king is like a monarch. That's what you call it, like a monarchy. Like the people at the top of that are the monarchs. So William and Mary become the new monarchs during the Glorious Revolution. Meanwhile, in the colonies, people are trying to, get more rights, and their rights are restored by William and Mary, but, they're still fighting for other rights, and that one of the big rights that comes into play at this time is freedom of the press, and that comes to light during the John Peter Zenger trial, and this is on page 141. So this has to do with freedom of the press. This whole story with John Peter Zenger is he writes some criticisms about New York's governor. So John Peter Zenger, he's criticizing New York's governor, and what he's saying are true things. They're true statements, but the governor doesn't care. He doesn't want to be made fun of or doesn't want to be shown in a bad light. What happens is he goes to court. He's taken there. He's going to, be thrown in jail for saying that the governor is taking bribes, which the governor is actually taking bribes. And what ends up happening is he is released because they argue that, as long as people speak the truth, they should be able to write down whatever they want. The problem becomes if you are writing something that's not true. So it's okay for Peter Zenger to write down, the governor of New York is taking bribes and he's a bad dude because he takes bribes. That's fine. The governor might not like that, but it's not his place to throw him in jail. I mean, he shouldn't do the bad things if he doesn't want those bad things written down. Now, John Peter Zenger could be thrown in jail if he starts writing down that the governor of New York likes to go out in the middle of the night, dress up like a woman, and kill puppies. I mean, that's not true. That's not what he does. That's, paints him in a bad light, and it's not true. So it's not fair to write things that aren't true about somebody. So, freedom of the press, John Peter Zenger, you can speak the truth, all this kind of stuff. Now, with salutary neglect, we kind of go back a little bit to William and Mary. So during this time, with William and Mary being the monarchs of England, the colonies are allowed to kind of do things on their own and self-govern, and that gets them used to this independence. I give the example in my class about if your parents said, hey, you can stay out as late as you want, go wherever you want, check in sometimes, but we're not going to worry about it. You can do whatever you want. Just we'll be all right with it. So you get used to that independence. You're staying up until 5:30 in the morning. You're not coming home for weeks at a time, whatever it may be. And then all of a sudden, next year at this time, they say, okay, now we don't want this anymore. We don't like it. We want you to be in bed at 6 p.m. every night. So you would have gotten used to that independence, and now you have all these rules in place on you, and that is going to create a lot of conflict between you and your parents. So that's kind of what happens with England and the colonies. The colonies are used to this salutary neglect, which means beneficial neglect, or being left alone for the benefit of yourself. And they get used to that independence, and now what we're going to see is that independence is taken away and a lot of rules are put into place. So that's salutary neglect. Now we're going to move on to the French and Indian War. So a few things about the French and Indian War. The first thing that you have to understand is that it is not a war between the French and the Indians. It is a we call it the French and Indian War because that is who the British are fighting. So the French are in the yellow territory, the British are in the purple-ish territory, and what causes this war is that British fur traders are moving on to French territory, so then there's going to be some conflict, and yeah, so X's mean conflict. The French and Indian War, we're talking about this on page 143. If we look at pre-war boundaries, the British have some of this coastland, but the French have a lot of territory over here. And as we get into this war, the French are winning a lot. The British are not really putting up much of a fight. Benjamin Franklin, who is this guy down here, he suggests the Albany Plan of Union, which is on 144. It is basically the first plan to unite the colonies. And, it's a plan. They don't go through with it because the colonies don't want to lose their power. But, he thinks that, we're never going to win this war if we don't work together, if we don't unite. And eventually, the colonies and Britain turn it around a little bit because the people in England send over the best generals and more troops, and they put William Pitt in charge of the war, and things start turning around, and they win the Battle of Quebec, and eventually the British win this war. And at the end of the war, there are some conflicts with Native Americans out in the frontier, because if you look at it, now all of this is now British, and they are going to take over these little forts all over the place. And when the French were there, they would give Native Americans gifts, and the British don't want to do that, so it caused a lot of conflict. Where there's X's, there's conflict. So causes a lot of conflict with the Native Americans and British and the settlers going over there. So what the British decide to do is they don't want to deal with all of this conflict anymore, so they put in the Proclamation of 1763, and you can look at this on page 148. It's this line that's right here, and it says that you cannot move west of the Appalachian Mountains. So can't move west of Appalachian Mountains. And, that's going to make the colonists really angry, first of all, because they just fought for all of this land out here. People died for this land out here, and now they're saying, the government is saying, you can't use that. Your husband, your brother, your son died for that land, but you can't use it. And that's going to make the colonists really angry. And a lot of their anger is going to be forced upon England, the king, and